everyone. Welcome to MRD Chatroom. Today we will be meeting Ruth E. Blackman. And before I talk a little bit about Ruth, I just want to give you a little profile about who Ruth is, because she is going to share with you. There's so much wrapped up in this Ruth. She reminds me of the Ruth in the Bible, and I'm sure she has a Boaz waiting somewhere. Ruth is an administrative professional dedicated to public service. She says she draws her inspiration from the words uttered by the late President John F. Kennedy. Ask not what your country can do for you, but ask what you can do for your country. Ruth is a creative leader who seeks to build alliances. She uses challenges as opportunities for progress and inspires and motivates her team to achieve greater productivity. This is Ruth in a nutshell. But today we have more than a nutshell to share with you. So I want to welcome you, Ruth.
It's good to be here.
So wonderful to meet you. Can you just tell me, who is Ruth Blackman, really?
Ruth Blackman, a very simple girl from the village who, through the grace of God and education and a very supportive family, became what she is today. That's Ruth in a nutshell.
Yes.
Right? And I had a primary education at Carrington's Primary, right in the village. Then I was among those to benefit from free education when it came on stream. So I was a pupil of the St. Michael's Girls' School. We were all girls then. And when I look back and remember that at school we only had a roll of 500 and somebody students. Now the roll is double that, or maybe even more. But the advantage of having that kind of small gathering is that everybody knew everybody. And Constance Innes was the head teacher, and she knew every pupil. And even after leaving school, you're walking through Bridgetown and you butt upon Miss Innes. Hi, Ruth. But you remember me? Of course. That was the type of person she was, and that was the advantage given her by a small, small numbers. And then, of course, I had the grammarian, Miss Pat Simmons, who a lot of people know in her afterlife, but you're following her footsteps. She was a teacher of English.
Wow.
At St. Michael's Girls. Yes. And we used to call her the grammarian, because you had to speak standard English wherever you were in school, because if she heard you otherwise, it would be excuse me, So, I mean, so persons like that, also instilled that type of discipline and so on within us girls at that school. So, and then, of course, I went on then to Barbados Community College, then on to the University of the West Indies Mona campus, which was the only campus teaching social work at the time. And then I got the opportunity to go to Harvard, where I did my master's in public administration. Mm-hmm. My first degree at Mona was in social work, as implied. Mm-hmm. Harvard was public administration. And I also became a student of cultural studies at the postgrad level at Cave Hill. Mm-hmm. And then I also dabbled in project management as well, having been exposed to the PATU course at the Caribbean Development Bank, and a lot of other little things offered through government, being a public servant, and then of my own volition, I sought to educate myself in other areas. Yeah.
So you've given me an enriching introduction to your life as a student, and you're talking a little bit about the public service. You've given me your educational journey. So can you tell me a bit now about your journey? What led you to being, I know that when I heard about you, I heard that you were a former PS. And I know PS, some people don't know what that stands for, but that's permanent secretary. So I'm sure that there's a journey. So can you give me a little bit of that journey to being a permanent secretary? Because I'm sure that that's not the only thing that we are leading up to being a permanent secretary.
Well, my journey began on the 9th of September, 1969, when I was supposed to be going back to school, because we were waiting to find out where we were going to spend the next year or two. Mm-hmm. St. Michael's did not have a sixth form, and it was highly unlikely that Queen's College would have taken persons because, limited space, and of course, their students counted above other persons. So we were all waiting for community college. So we had all applied, but we were unsure if we would have been accepted or not. So while waiting for the acceptance, I decided I'm not going back in no schoolroom at the secondary level, but I don't want to stay home either. So I walked from Clarendon's Village, where I lived, to Maxwellton, Cullamorock, service commissions. That was the place to go if you want to work in the government service. And I had always pledged to make the public service my area of employ because of benefiting from free education. It was something burning in me to give back. So I never considered working for a private entity. So that morning I walked to service commissions. I went in and I told them I wanted a job. And, I had the certificates and so on to show and all that, my O-levels. And I remember being given an envelope. And I was told, take this to QEH. There's an assignment there for you. And I walked from Cullamorock to Martindale's Road, QEH, met the head of personnel, gave that person the envelope. It was a man. I think his name was Mr. Thorne or Thornhill, but I know it was a Thorne something. Yeah. And I remember when he opened the envelope, he said, you realize that you are coming to a vacant position? So in my heart, I just clasped my hands and said, thank you, Jesus. Because a lot of persons, as you know, joining the public service, you would come in and you'll work a month here, then you'll go and work a month there. Yeah. And there was this constant moving. Sometimes you go back home, and then you're recalled. But I was very fortunate because I walked into the public service that day and I left on the 23rd of July, 2018, when I proceeded to pre-retirement leave. I never had to break. So I give God thanks for that. So I went to QEH and I was hired as a clerical officer in the accounts department. And that was an experience in itself. But meanwhile, I hadn't heard from community college yet. And it was some 2 weeks later that I got a call for an interview. And Charlie Bess, as we used to call him, was the principal. And I remember I was 17 at the time, and he said, well, you have to come from whichever date. I said, but sir, I haven't drawn my first paycheck yet, so I'm not coming. He said, but you're too young to be working and studying. I said, well, sir, I'm sorry, but I can't quit now. And he said, okay, let's make a compromise. I would allow you to come during the first year, because it was a 2-year program, working and studying, but if your grades don't keep up, you have to quit work and come in full time. Well, I worked my butt off because I was not giving up on that. So that was how my journey started in the public service, QEH, as a clerical officer.
Yes, and then from here, what happened after that? How long did you spend at the QEH, and where did you go afterwards? Because we're talking about your journey to being a PS.
Yes. Okay. So I worked as a clerical officer from September that morning, 1969. And then I got appointed in January 70. In those days, you didn't have to wait too long for appointments. Right. And especially you're in a vacant post as well. And then I remember it was the June of that said year, 1970, that I started to act as assistant accountant within the accounts department. And I was sort of young in the service, but I thank God for the type of supervisors that I had. Mr. Kenneth Pyle, as the people would say, God rest him. He was an outstanding senior accountant. And I'm sure he will go down in the annals of history, or has gone down in the annals of history, for his contribution to QEH, as an institution in the financial area. And he used to hold classes in bookkeeping and all those things. If you were interested, you could, go in his office and he would explain the rudiments of finance and so on to you. And that was where my love for figures came in.
Yeah.
And that stayed with me right up to PS level. But so I acted as assistant accountant during that time. And that was for 6 months. And then immediately that ended, I went straight then to act as senior clerk in the said accounts department. And that was from the July and until the September. And that got broken because I always wanted to be a social worker.
Right.
Right? I came from a situation where I saw a lot of lives not being fulfilled because family support systems were poor. But I could have been one of those persons, but because of the family support systems that I had, I realized how important it was for people to have people in their lives that if something happens, that support system is there to pull that person back. So my parents, had that kind of support system.
Yes.
And because of it, in looking for a career, I realized that through the medium of social work, I could be a support system for persons who may or could have fallen through the cracks. And so I chose to be a social worker. So the opportunity came for me to join, to become a social worker. So in September again, rather than continuing with the assistant accountant, senior clerk at the time, I joined the welfare fraternity in Barbados.
Okay. So you've told me that you would have started out as a clerk. You would have gone into the role of accountant, but I am getting the idea that the impetus for being a social worker, you saw that people needed help. So can you tell me a little bit more about your life as a social worker? Because I can hear the passion already, and you were willing to leave accounting, but I noticed that you seem to have jobs where they're lucrative jobs, and this journey is from one lucrative job to another. So let's hear a little bit more about your social work experience.
Okay, I worked as a social worker for 13 years, at least directly into social work at the welfare department for approximately 13 years. And I met I met a broad, how I put it, several types of persons. I met young people who were struggling. I met older people who were lonely and felt that they had no one. I met couples whose marriages were falling apart. I met children with behavior problems. And my goal there was to make life better. I didn't succeed with everybody, but I think I succeeded with the majority. And today, there are a lot of those persons on the street. Some of them were little kids when I was working with the families, but they still remember me, even although I am grown. And some of them, their parents pointed me out and said, "You see that lady? Blah, blah, blah," And I thank God that I was able to intervene for the better in a lot of persons' lives. But I should say this, when I first started out as a social worker, I was in medical social work.
Right.
But I found it very hard at an emotional level to to work in that area.
Tell us why.
Because,
Tell us why.
because a lot of people you dealt with were terminally ill.
Right.
And I know people will come into the office to get their medication and so on. And the nature of the medication told me how far along they were, how close to death they were. And that used to pain me inside to know that I could not help prolong life. I was not a medical doctor. And even the doctors at some point in time would have stated, "Ma'am, I can do no more for you." I remember an incident where the doctor had told this particular lady, "This is it." And that lady cried, and she wanted to know what she was going to do with her children, what's going to happen. I had to run into the room. That ripped me up, you know. And then another case where I was on the particular ward, and this old gentleman was in so much pain, and he was crying. And there was this nurse over him just patting him and saying, "Daddy is going to be okay. Daddy is going to be okay." And he was apologizing for crying. And he was saying, "But when the pain hit me, nurse," she said, "It's okay, Daddy." I saw that the whole night. And I decided I can't work in this environment. Let me become a generic social worker. The emotion was too strong. I remember speaking to nurses and so on working in radiology, and they said, "Oh, you get accustomed." I could not get accustomed, because how do I sit down and tell a person, "Well, you know, you only have 3 months, so you have to put your affairs in order. Have you written your will?" I couldn't deal with that. You know, no, and that was probably why in those days, social workers had to be a particular age, because at age 19, that was a little too much for me. But I moved into the generic side, and it was fun there.
So, but before you get to tell me a little bit about the generic side, I want you to just give me an idea. What if you had to say something to people who will want to be involved in social work? What advice would you give them, given what you've gone through? You said there was a lot of emotional trauma, but would you encourage people to still get involved in social work? What advice would you give them?
I would encourage them, but I would tell them they have to have the aptitude for it. To be a social worker, you have to love people. You have to care about people. You have to be committed to helping persons who are finding it difficult to navigate life's waters, how to find a better path, you know. And you have to be encouraging as well. You know, in social work, there's a principle called non-emotional involvement, which is easier said than done, because there are times when that emotion is very raw, you know. I mean, if you meet a person and a husband who maltreated his wife, and she's there in front of you broken, you know, and you know the marriage is going to break because that husband maybe has made up his mind. And it can happen vice versa too, but in my situation, it was mostly the guys. And you have to help her to come to grips with that situation and move on with her life. But you have to still be there for her, you know, in case she falls, in case it becomes too much. So to be a social worker, you have to have the aptitude for it. You can't be treating people any old how. You can't be wielding power, because there are some professions that can easily happen. And social work is one, because it's as if the lives of these people are in your hands. And, you know, if you say go, it is go. And if you say stop, it is stop. That attitude is not correct. So you have to have the proper attitude, the proper aptitude, but you have to care about people and about their well-being, whether that person is a child or an elderly person. You have to, you know, you have to have that type of compassion without becoming totally emotionally involved that you are no help to that person. You have to learn how to strike that balance.
Okay.
So I would encourage people to be social workers, and we need them now more than ever, especially our young people.
Why do you think we need them now more than ever? And can you give me a kind of snapshot of what you're seeing in terms of social work as as we view it today?
Well, you hear a lot of stories, and I'm not here to judge because I don't work in the area, directly. So I would not judge anybody. But I would say this. In my conversations with young people, and I still have a close affinity with them. In fact, it was my area of specialty when I was studying social work. In fact, that was my thesis, looking at the whole adolescence from a developmental perspective. And, I sit down and I have some long chats with some young people. And I realized that a lot of them just need some guidance. I remember back when I was practicing, there was a 19-year-old, and I think she had 2 or 3 children, and we were paired together by an experienced social worker working in another agency, not even the welfare department. But she felt that we were of the same age and that would be a connection. I remember speaking to this person, and that person said at one of the counseling sessions, if I had someone who would speak to me or who would have spoken to me the way that you are speaking to me now, my life would not be in this mess. So sometimes people just need someone to listen, and point them in a particular direction, and it could save a life of heartache, And then there are other people whose life circumstances are such that poverty and hardship becomes like a life cycle. And you have to encourage that person to break that cycle. Because your mother was X or your father was X doesn't mean you have to be. You can purpose in your life to change, but they can't do it all by themselves. And there's where now the social worker comes in to give them that kind of support and guidance, and maybe solicit other agencies to come and be there for that person. So you're not giving them a handout,
Right.
although sometimes you have to, but you're also giving them a hand up.
Yeah.
I remember there was this lady that I met. I was at agriculture then, and it was a World Food Day. And this person came to me and said, my mom told me to tell you that we have made it. We are all here. Wow. And I remember the ministry secretary was with me when that happened. And I was there saying, well, I don't know this lady. What's she talking about? And then she explained who she was and what happened. And I can't tell you a lie. I mean, the tears just came because I remembered what that family would have gone through.
Yeah.
But seeing her there in a very high executive job now, and she came with that message, I said, Lord, thank you for the privilege of at least doing some good to affect a life of change for the better, So there are those moments of satisfaction, or I'm sitting and, so many different persons and pictures are coming into my head. I remember meeting a particular guy somewhere, and his mom was there too. And the next morning, that was the Saturday, and the Monday morning at work, I remember it was Deputy PS then, and the then PS came and said, someone wants to see you. And this person came in, and I said, hi, how are you? I know this person now in a particular position. And the person said, my mom told me I have to come and make myself known to you. And then he told me who the mom was,
Right.
And I said, but I know you when you were a little boy. No, you are a big man, a businessman, have his own business and everything, right? And that lady was a fighter.
Right.
Right? And she fought for her kids, and with the support that was given by an institution like the welfare department, every one of those kids made it. And she made it as a result as well. So those are the things that bring that kind of satisfaction that you were able to help. You're not lording it because God is the final person, but using the skills that he gave you and that you were exposed to, you were able to bring a level of satisfaction and development to a family in need.
So Ruth, it looks like you've touched so many lives. So having gone through that social work experience, you had told me that you moved from being the medical social worker because there was something about it that you know,
Emotionally,
because of that
yes.
emotional trauma, and then you said you moved on then to be a general social worker.
Yeah.
So what's the difference?
Well, in medical social work, you deal with persons within the medical, people with medical issues, um, illnesses, and so on. While with the generic social worker, it is more broad-based. Just like you have psychiatric social workers, so persons who deal with persons with neuroses and psychoses, those persons to be labeled or carry the title psychiatric social worker. So the medical social worker will be persons within the confines of a medical institution like the QEH, right? Or geriatric or so.
Yes.
Those are the persons that is what you would classify as a medical social worker. So although in the generic social work area, you may still deal with people who have mental disorders. You know, they're discharged, they're living on the outside, and they may still come to you for assistance. For example, we had a situation, I don't know how prevalent it is right now, where at one stage we had a lot of people being repatriated from England because of mental illness. You know, they served they spent some time in a mental institution in England, and then they were repatriated back home to Barbados. And some of those people became my clients, right? So I'm dealing with a person who has a history of a mental disorder, but dealing with it from a more generic perspective. So I would not have gotten into the deep counseling, like say the psyche social work would have gotten into. I would more look after their general well-being. So so you have those differences,
Yes.
right? You have those differences.
Yeah.
But the social work element continued when I left welfare
Yes.
and I joined the National Cultural Foundation.
Tell me a bit about that experience.
Yes, because the National Cultural Foundation was not all crop over, NIFCA, festivals and all that. It used to be community development back in the day, 1984. Because there was no community development department back then. That was sort of subsumed by the National Culture Foundation, just as Women's Affairs were. So National Culture Foundation, when it first started, looked after cultural development using a kind of two-prong approach. You had community development and artistic development. And those two things combined to produce cultural development. So we worked at the community level. And then you had women's affairs, right? Because the women's element was so important, especially when it came to family development and so on in Barbados and children and so. So that became part of the NCF, as well as youth affairs. Not youth affairs as we know it today. It was a little more than a desk back then. But so those were the elements that comprised the NCF. But in the community development area, and social work carries different areas of study. You do social legislation, you do social administration or social policy as it's called today, and you do community development, right? And so rather than working in the office counseling on a one-on-one or focus group with a family, you work in the community. So like all those community centers and so on that we have around Barbados, those were the different spaces where a lot of the young people and so on gathered. And you were going to a community, find out what the issues were, and help those young people to solve the problems for themselves. Because you can't solve problems for them, but you can listen and give guidance and help them to find solutions to the problems experienced in their community. And I think back then, that's why we had a lot of groups, but not groups in terms of gangs like what we have now.
Right.
Because a lot of the development of gangs and so on are people looking for a sense of belonging. It just happens that the road to that belonging is sort of warped. So it's manifested then in guns and drugs. But a lot of those young people are looking for identity and a sense of belonging that they maybe can't find in the household, you know, or the wholesome groups, quote unquote, are not available in the area, right? But back then, we had a lot of youth groups in Barbados. You know, they flourished all over. Every community had a youth group or some form of togetherness. When I look back at Carrington's Village where I grew up, we had football, Rainbow for Wales. We had basketball, Royals. We had cricket. The some association was Spartan, that was the formal cricket, but you had the tape ball cricket on what we call the Gully Hill. When it came to cultural things, you had the landscape. You know, we used to talk about going by the baton, right? You had the blue rhythm, what you call it, there was a steel pan called, it wasn't blue rhythm. Blue rhythm combo was a band that had some carnival people too, but this was a steel band. So we had a steel band. You also had, you wouldn't know about this, you're too young, the village choirs, right? Yes. So here it was, you had all, and then of course you had churches everywhere. Yes. So a lot of the church groups, you know, used to be part of the community as well. So you would leave home to go by Carrington's Primary School because every Tuesday night the church army go meet there. That's the Anglican group. And that's the only time you would have found Anglicans beating tambourines and that kind of stuff. Totally transformed from the solemn, stoic worship that you would have seen on Sunday mornings. So the churches were very much a part of the community as well and had junior choirs, and the Sunday schools were vibrant. But now you don't have that type of gathering, you know. So, you know, the old people used to say that the devil find work for idle hands. So we have a lot of young people right now who just pass through school. They go in and they come out, you know, because as you go in and 16, you're out, you know. So a lot of them come out and there's nothing to show for those years spent in an institution.
So, Ruth, so what do you think needs to be done then within our country now? Because we have, you've talked a lot about the gun violence, you talk about the lawlessness. So do you have any solutions for us? Because I'm sure.
We have to get back to community development. And community development is not only having a cricket match here and a cricket match. I mean, I remember when the NCF first started, and we started moving from community to community. We brought back people like Sir Clay Gullah out of retirement. I remember he was my boss when I joined the welfare department. And I remember he said, but Ruth, you know, you bring me out of retirement, but I love it. Because he got caught up in moving from community to community, meeting with these various young people. And sometimes there were no community centers, but people opened up their houses. So we met in people's verandas. We met under tamarind trees. Wherever people felt that they could gather and have community, we met. And we guided the discussion. They chose the topics. I remember we had a meeting a time, I think it was in Bosco Bell, at the Bosco Bell Community Center. And Elombe Motley, who was the director of the NCF at the time, you know, when we have these things, he would pass around and see how things were going. And when he came down and saw the community center packed, and we were discussing family life issues, he said, but how want to get these people involved in this boring topic and being so enthusiastic about it? I said, you see, they chose the topic. And they were discussing something that they had a concern about. So as a result, they bought into it. And I remember Deacons. We had this meeting down at Deacons. And in those days, you had some famous TV programs. I can't even, I could remember the actors, but not necessarily the names now. But everybody used to be crowded around the TV at this particular hour to watch this particular television series. So we are at Deacons and a conversation going, but on the stroke of, I think, 8 o'clock or somewhere like that, people start creeping out. And I remember one, the same young people in the audience got up and said, you see, we are here sitting down discussing something serious. And you're all running to see a TV program, not even about Barbados, but something about the US, and blah, blah, blah. And he carried on. And one by one, everybody slinked back in and sat down, right? And the conversation continued. People, this that sense of belonging, that sense of discussing what concerns me today, right, mattered. Right now, I don't think we are giving the young people enough space to do that. I don't think so. When it was PS culture, I remember that we had a tournament, a chess tournament across communities led by Suki King. And I remember talking to one of the champion, and he had a record, spent some time, incarceration and so on. And I mean, there's a guy and he playing chess and passionate about it. And I went to him and I said, what's so interesting about this? And he said, in my situation, I was there isolated, nothing to do, and, getting bored, and the men used to play chess, and I started, I went and I joined them, and I listened to the conversations, and I got to love the game. And then I realized that it called out some traits in me that I was not even aware that I had, things like discipline, concentration, and being able to outwit for the good somebody else and so on. He said, and those same principles I applied to my life generally, so that when I came back, into society, I used those same principles and I never stopped playing chess, right? So you have to look at, we call it in social work, the point of greatest reverberation.
Wow.
When you find out what makes that young person tick, and you go with that, you'll be surprised how that person opens up. And then when you realize that there are several people on that same wavelength, then you can bring them together. And that's where you get your focus groups, And then that person or those persons build such strong bonds with each other. And then they go out and look for people of like mind and decide, you don't have to deal with a gun.
Yeah.
You don't have to deal with drugs, right? Life can be better. And that is not easy, because I remember again talking to some young people. I remember one person said, my minimum wage say 150 a week. But I could go and just be a lookout and I get 1,000.
Wow.
You got to bridge that gap. And that's not easy, right? So apart from paying the 150 a week, going back to that time when the minimum wage was that, you got to find something now that going to cause them to self-actualize at a different level.
Yes.
Yes, they need to eat. So the 150 may give them that. But where else can they carry those creative juices to create something that they become passionate about? Some of the best artists that I have discovered that during my NCF days and so on came from Glengarry Prison.
Wow.
Fine artists. They used to win all the prizes in NIFCA.
Yes.
That's how they found their outlet. We took dance programs into the prison. And and they harness that energy into dance. And that was a way to express themselves in something in positive ways. Right? So the arts, and that's why, like I told you, the Lombe Motley, artistic expression and community development came together.
Yeah.
Poetry, writing, all the things that are playing on their mind, they were able to write out as poems, and then they performed them at NIFCA.
So Ruth, you talked, I love that expression. You said the point of greatest reverberation. I love that expression. So are you saying that's what's missing today?
I don't think that we spend enough time looking for it. A young person may be in trouble, and we just, maybe put him in jail or maybe whatever, we never really sit down. We haven't sat down with that young person to find out what really makes them tick, so that we can find that point of reverberation. One more example I can bring to you. You see, video. We had a situation where a lot of the young people, this time I was at Ministry of Social Transformation, and you're getting my journey coming out now in bits and pieces, right?
Yes.
And I remember the then minister, he said, we got to find, they were using video to film porn and all that. He said, no, 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 we got to find a way to make this thing more creative. Nah. So you decide to start a video program, you know. So they're using the video camera, but rather than filming naked girls or women, or they go and film something now that would tell a story about Barbados. And the thing is that what they have filmed now, we could use on CBC or elsewhere. And the name will go abroad in a positive way.
Yes.
You know, I know at Ministry of Culture, a video program, it still goes, you know, it's still carried on. And I know that there were some difficult kids who were given a lot of trouble at school, and they became part of that program. A lot of them are in that area of work today.
Beautiful.
Because of the exposure. So you got to know how to harness those creative energies and bring them out. And you'll find then that because of being, becoming so aligned with that creativity, the guns and so on then start to peel.
So,
right?
so Ruth, where do you think we need to start? Do we need to start over? And I'm sure we're talking about education transformation. That's the buzzword. That's what we're talking about today. And do you have any advice for the Ministry of Education? Do you have any advice for the educators? Because I know, you know, when we go into the schools, we have to nurture them from the early childhood education all the way up. So do you have any advice for the Ministry of Education, for us as educators?
I am not an educator. I have two sisters who happen to be teachers. One in the primary school, well, they're both retired now, and one at the university level, right? Abroad. She was a professor, right? And with the one in primary, I used to admire, because she's early childhood education, and I used to admire when kids would come into her class, a blank slate. And next thing you know, they can write the name, they can count, they start to learn tables, and you could see this child growing. And I used to say, girl, you are so good, you know, because these kids come to you, except they come from homes where some parents do inculcate certain things in the kids before they get into the classroom. But some of them you start from scratch, and you see these children blossom. You understand? But back in my day, and I don't believe in going back, but I don't believe in throwing away the baby with the bathwater either. There are things back then that are good that we can use and then add the modernity to it, right? Extracurricular activities played a very large part in the life of kids, young children, teenagers back then. And also, and why I say extracurricular activities? Because some schools do not have music classes formally, dance classes formally. So a lot of it came about through extracurricular activities. And a lot of the kids, because of coming immersed in learning how to play an instrument, singing, dancing, and so on, there was no time. And then sports was a big thing as well. And this to me was a kind of a balance even in the workplace. I'll come to that. But at school, you learn these 3 R's, you know, the French, the Spanish, the English, the maths, everything. But then the creative side brings the balance. It brings the balance. And you'll find that if that kid is I always call people kids, if those children are given the opportunity to express themselves artistically and so on,
Yeah.
you'll find that the other word comes up. And that brings me another example. 49 years and 2 months, so
Yes.
forgive me for the examples. Every time I say something, I can remember something
49
else.
years and 2 months.
Right. I remember at the Ministry of Social Transformation, we had something called Community Art Career Workshops. And led by a girl, a female, and I'm going to call her name because she needs to be recognized in Barbados, Susan Phillips.
Wow.
And she brought this proposal to the department and the ministry, and we bought it. And she started this community art career workshop. And I remember there was a particular youngster who was not doing well at school at all. He was at one of our leading secondary schools, was not doing well. And his mother, she tried everything because she wasn't giving up. And she knew where these classes were being held. And she brought that child, but he was too young. And I remember they were saying, but he's too young, he's too young. And then Susan decided, man, you know something? Let's give him a chance. That child came into that workshop, showed that he had some talent in terms of art. Because that's the only subject that he was doing at school that made any sense to him. And you know, when he realized that, the older people in the class, all of them sort of hovered around him, embraced him, encouraged him. And you know, all the other subjects then picked up. Wow. And he started to excel. He had a art show at a gallery, a local gallery, and someone from Scotland came, loved his work, and bought everything.
Wow.
Then opportunities were created that he could have studied abroad, right? The rest is history. You understand?
Yeah.
So that balance. And when it comes to the workplace, as I was telling you in a previous conversation, the formal and the informal must go hand in hand. And this is where leadership comes in.
Yes.
Leadership cannot only be technical. Leadership must be creative and adaptable. Because the only thing constant is change.
Yes.
And you have to be able to adapt as things change. I have seen everything in those 49 years and 2 months that I worked in the service. I saw from pounding the typewriter and the gas technic ink to the computer and the photocopying machine. You understand?
Yes.
And you had to adjust to that. I saw situations where relationships were horrible, but because somebody found out that this body had an interest in something, like in one situation, who could have cooked soup the best. So he decided, okay, we're going to have a day that everybody going to bring lunch, we potluck, and we'll see who the soup tastes the best.
Okay.
And that broke the ice.
Yeah. So thank you for being a part of MRD Chat Room.